I would argue that contracts is the fundamental backbone of any business practice, and it can touch us personally in our day-to-day lives, as well as be very important when you're starting up your business, if you're working for somebody else, if you're negotiating any type of contract, as a vendor, as a buyer. Contract law becomes pervasively incredibly important. So what we're going to try to do today and next week is to start going over the contract basics, and it's my objective that after these next 2 weeks you should be able to draft a very simple contract, and that will be one of our exercises, probably not this week but maybe next week, is for us to have a very boilerplate contract that you can use for your business as you go on. So that would be our objective. So let's start off talking conceptually about what a contract is. And I'm just going to make it very simple. And a contract is simply an agreement to do something. It's where you have more than one parties that come together with hopefully a meeting of the minds about what the contract should be. And we'll talk about meeting of the minds and the concept of mistake as a defense to contracting probably next week. But hopefully at the very beginning of stages, both parties have in their minds a set of objectives that they're bargaining for. Now, let's go back a little bit and talk about the idea of capacity. So to enter into a contract, the party has to have a certain ability to enter into a contract. So a lot of people say, now, Mr. Silverman, it's obvious that a minor cannot enter into a contract because they don't have the requisite understanding of basic legal principles. Well, you'll see that that is a fallacy as we move forward. Contracts that are entered into by minors could be either voidable, which means the minor may be able to squeeze out of that contract, or it could be void on its face. So just to look at where we are in terms of our analysis of contracts, we're starting at sort of a high-level view, and the first critical element is to answer the question, do the parties have the requisite capacity to enter into a contract? So, again, this concept of a minor who, and I think in California it's under the age of 18, can they enter into a contract? Well, anybody can enter into a contract. The question is, will that contract be supportable or sustainable, or can it be performed? And there are two classes of contracts. So if I'm a minor and I'm going into Perry's grocery store to buy food, and I'm 17 years old, that is what we call a voidable contract. It's voidable because I'm contracting for what we call necessaries of life. I need food to live. Now, if I'm a minor and I have a lawn mowing service, I may need a lawnmower and cutting supplies and trash bags. And if I went into Perry's store to buy those goods, then she could hold me to that contract, but I might also be able to rescind that contract. And I could argue that, well, I didn't really understand the terms of the contract because I was only 17 years old, and a lot of the issues in the contract, even if it's on a handshake, may not be enforceable. Now, contrast that to a completely different type of contract, where I go into a car dealership, I'm 17 years old, and I want to buy a Ferrari. All right, I want to buy a $100,000 car, and my parents found out, CJ, what are you doing? Are you nuts? How could you go into a Ferrari dealership and buy a $120,000 car when you don't even have a job? And my parents would probably march down to the Ferrari dealership and say, hey, you got to let this kid out of this contract. And they're going to say, well, there's no way. He signed the documents and he's creditworthy, and he put down a $10,000 down payment from his lawn mowing business. And my parents are going to say, hey, look, we're going to go to a lawyer because this is a void contract. Why is it void? on its face because it's not for a necessary of life. I don't need that Ferrari to sustain my life unless I have a luxury car limousine service or something like that, which would probably be unbelievable at my age, because at age 17 I probably couldn't even get financing or even insurance for a really high-end limousine service. But you see how these two concepts are distinguishable. If I'm entering as a minor and I'm under 18, if I'm entering into the contract for necessaries or necessaries of life, that's a voidable contract, but I could be held to it. But if it's for something that's not necessary for my life, that's void on its face. And I could rescind that contract. Or my legal guardians could rescind that on my behalf. So any questions about the difference between these two kinds of contracts, one being for a necessary of life and one being for something that's outside the realm of reality? Yes?
So technically, like, minors that sign, like, say, like, phone contracts for, like, 2 years, could they just void that because it's not necessary for life?
Absolutely. So a phone contract with unconscionable terms could probably be escapable, unless, you could prove that that kid's running his own business and he needed that phone to run his business. Hopefully it's a legal business. Yeah, good question. Any other questions before we move on? All right. So now we've talked about capacity, and there's an interesting case that I want you to take a look at online, which is the very first case I got questioned on in law school. And for some reason, the contracts professor called on my name out of a list of 100 students. And Mr. Suman, I want you to tell me about the case of Lucy versus Zamer. And he thought I was just going to come up there and stumble and be nervous, but I had actually researched that case extensively, and I started asking him questions, and then he asked me to sit down because he started getting flustered. It was kind of fun. But anyhow, the case of Lucy versus Zamer, aside from just giving me some interesting memories, is a really cool case. What happens is that Lucy and Zamer enter into a contract for Lucy to sell, or Mr. Lucy, to sell his house to Mr. Zamer. And this transaction takes place in a bar. And Lucy is trying to use a defense of intoxication and saying, hey, I didn't really mean to sell my house. I was completely drunk. And a reasonable person would never sell their house for $40,000 because the real value was $80,000. I'm just making up the numbers. But at the time of trial, Zamer, the defendant, introduced a lot of party witnesses that came to court and said, hey, Mr. Lucy didn't look that drunk. He was able to walk out of the bar okay, and actually he drove home, or he was able to get home with no problem. So this is just an attempt for Mr. Lucy to get out of the contract by claiming he didn't have the requisite capacity to enter into the contract. Now contrast that to somebody who is incredibly drunk and they don't really know what they're doing, or somebody who doesn't have the mental capacity to enter into a contract, like a minor would be one example, or somebody who is just mentally incapable of entering into a contract. They might not even know their name, so how could they enter into a contract? So the interesting thing in the other issue in Lucy versus Zamer is that this contract is reduced to a napkin. They wrote it out on a cocktail napkin, and Lucy also tries to argue, hey, you can't write a contract on a napkin. That's not going to be enforceable. It has to go through a lawyer. It has to be incredibly formal. Well, that's just not true. As a matter of fact, we'll see that some oral agreements are enforceable. Some aren't. When we talk about the statute of frauds, you'll see that some types of contracts must be in writing to be enforceable, but others, if I'm going to get my hair cut at a barber salon or a beauty salon, I'm not signing a contract because they're providing a service. Don't worry about that right now. We'll talk about that later. But the point is that Lucy tried to argue that he had lack of capacity to enter into the contract, and he tried to wiggle out of the contract. The court didn't believe him because the witnesses said that he didn't really seem that drunk. Now, if the facts were a little bit different, and Lucy was like bombed out of his mind, and he could have called witnesses to say he didn't even know his middle name, or he lost his last name in a skiing accident, then maybe he shouldn't be a proper plaintiff in the case. So that's capacity. It's ability to enter into the contract and understand the terms of the contract. Now, let's talk about legality. let's say for a moment that I am hiring somebody to get rid of my ex-wife. Now that would never happen. First of all, I'm still friends with my ex-wife, and I would never do harm to anybody. But let's just say that we got into an argument, and I decided that I wanted Monica to knock off my ex-wife, right? And we enter into a contract, and Monica says, you know, I do this all the time. This is my business, but I'm going to give you a special deal because you're my business law instructor, and I'm going to charge you only $10,000 to get rid of my ex-wife, all right? And so we signed a contract, and I said, you know, that's fair. You know, get rid of that misery. You know, get rid of that misery for $10,000. It's a fair deal. Somebody else offered 20, so you've got a fair offer there. And we signed a contract, and then instead of carrying out the deal, she decides to go to Mexico and sit on the beach with her friends and spend the $10,000. And I come into court, right? I come into court, and Perry's the judge, and I said, now, Your Honor, I entered into a valid contract with Monica to bump off my ex-wife, and instead of doing what she was supposed to do, instead of honoring the terms of the contract, she spent the money in Mexico. And I subpoenaed all these records, and I can prove that she spent the money and she didn't carry out the deed. And what are you going to say? Well, you're going to say, I'm sorry, Ms. Sobin, you should know by teaching contract law and having taught it for many years that that's a legal contract. No court is going to enforce an illegal contract, right? It's against public policy to enforce an illegal contract. Now, there could be a different type of illegal contract which may have been legal at the time we entered into it, but now it becomes illegal. All right? So let's say that Eric and I are going to build a casino on Treasure Island. And his family is going to put in millions of dollars, and he has a family that's been involved in gaming for many years. And we decided to have a joint venture, and we're going to stick a casino on Treasure Island. And at the time that we enter into that deal, there's no problem, right? Actually, the city of San Francisco and the federal land authorities, they're looking about positive ways to use that land to earn some revenue, okay? And so everybody's on board. We want to have this casino on Treasure Island, but then the city council enacts an ordinance saying, sorry, you guys, it's now illegal to carry out this. We decided that it's going to be illegal to have a casino on Treasure Island. And by the way, this was a real case. There was a real proposal to have gaming on Treasure Island in San Francisco, or was Alcatraz, one of those places. Anyhow, if we decide to carry out our business, now we're subjecting each other to criminal liability. And if Eric sues me and says, hey, look, my parents want their $20 million back, and I spent it on the infrastructure of the casino, and I hired people, builders, and I bought all these machines, it's going to probably be very difficult for him to get his money back, because now building the casino is now illegal, right? So if you have a contract where the subject matter is illegal, then no court will enforce that contract. Does everybody follow me on that? So if you have an illegal intent, like hurting somebody, or if you entered into a contract which was once legal, but now it's no longer legal, no court will enforce that contract. Okay, any questions about that? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the meeting of the minds. Now, if I'm selling, tell me your name again.
Angie.
Angela?
Angie.
Angie. I am selling Angie 100 blue balloons for her birthday, okay? Angie loves balloons. And she says, you know what, I would love 2 dozen blue balloons, but I'd rather have 6 dozen red balloons. Do we have a deal? No, because I'm offering blue balloons and Angie wants red balloons. So we have no fundamental deal here. We have no meeting of the minds. So what do we have? If I'm offering Angie blue balloons and she says, you know what, CJ, I love red balloons. What she's done is she's engaged in what we call a counter offer. Counter offer. What a counter offer is first a rejection of my offer and a proposal for a new deal. Now, Am I bound to accept her new offer? Absolutely not. Once, however, once Angie suggests a counteroffer, my offer's off the table. It's done. She can't enforce my offer to sell her the blue balloons for $2 a piece. Maybe that was a great deal, but once she said, you know, CJ, I want red balloons for 50 cents each, we have no meeting of the minds, right? Because the basic subject matter of the contract was blue balloons, not red balloons, or vice versa. So we have different things in our head. We can't have a deal. Just like when you're negotiating a contract. If I'm thinking of delivery in 30 days, and Scott's thinking of delivery in 60 days, we don't have a meeting of the minds. We don't have a deal. Whether I'm full of capacity to engage in that contract, and it's a totally legal contract, if we don't have the same idea, then we don't have a contract. And we're going to dissect that a little bit more when we delve deeper into contracts. All right, so we've talked about voidable interests from a miner's perspective, and now we're going to talk about the difference between an offeror and an offeree. And I'll go back to my example with Angie. Initially, I was the offeror. I was making an offer to sell her blue balloons. But then she rejected my kind offer, and through her counter offer, she has now become the offeror. She's offering to buy red balloons. So things have switched around. Initially, I'm the offeror. Now Angie is the offeror. Do I have to accept her offer? No. Did she have to accept my offer? No. It's not required for anybody to accept anybody's offer. There's no absolute legal requirement. You can just walk away. You don't have to say anything. If silence is reasonable under the circumstances, you can just walk away, right? You don't have to assent or agree to anything. So I could offer you, everybody in the class said, if you read the next 2 chapters in your textbook and you're willing to take a quiz, you don't have to take your midterm, right? If I made that offer, you don't have to accept it. You say, forget it. I still want to take the midterm and the final. I'm not going to just take a quiz on the next 2 chapters because they're confusing to me. So you have the right to walk away from that offer. We all do. Even in everyday contract law, we are not duty-bound to accept anybody's offer, particularly if it's an illegal contract. All right. So, the offeror. I want you to learn this. Write this down. The offeror is the master of the offer. The offeror is the master of the offer and can take that offer away unless it's accepted. Once my offer is accepted, unless there's some other defenses, which we'll talk about later, then I can't take my offer away. Now, what if I give Angie 5 days to accept my offer, and on the 4th day I call her up and I say, sorry Angie, I changed my mind. I found somebody who will pay more for those balloons. She could sue me, right? Because I told her, I gave her the option of buying those balloons within 5 days, and now I've breached my offer, I breached my agreement by taking that deal off the table prematurely. Scott?
Even if it's just a verbal agreement, not in writing?
So it depends on the value. We'll talk about that under statute of frauds. Here in California, it used to be if the subject matter of a contract had a value of less than $500, it didn't have to be in writing.
Okay.
So it would matter what the quantity of balloons were and what the value. I mean, there are 3,000 balloons and they're $2,000 and they're $2 each. Then we're talking about a significant contract. That would have to be in writing.
Okay.
Now, interesting wrinkle, and we're kind of going ahead, but in order to avoid violating the statute of frauds, which is a statute that says certain contracts must be in writing, if I have an option contract, right, to sell something that's worth more than $500, that option contract must also be in writing. So if the underlying contract could violate the statute of frauds, and I'm extending her an option, say if you pay me $10, I'll keep this offer open for 6 months. That has to be in writing if the subject matter of that contract is more than $500. That's what it used to be. It could have gone up. Okay? Any questions on that? All right, wonderful. So if the offeror is truly the master of their offer, that means the offer could ask for anything they want to in terms of what we call acceptance. So, if I enter into a contract with somebody and I'm expecting to be honorable about my intent to enter that contract, and I want to sell my car for $500, and I put a little ad on the board. I'm going to sell my 1967 Pinto for $500, and the first person that walks up to the front of the class with a cashier's check made up to me wins the deal. All right? So the first person that comes down here, and well, you could say that's unfair because I can't walk very fast. And how can I beat everybody else down to the front of the room when I want the car? Well, I'm the master of my offer. I can say whatever I want to. Right? I can specify the terms of acceptance anyhow I wish, as long as it's reasonable. And, or I could say, look, anybody who wants to buy my Pinto, you have to send me a check within the next 2 days. And how do you accept that contract? Well, by sending a check. If you called me up and you said, hey, CJ, I want to buy your car, is that a valid acceptance? No. Because I said, as a master of my offer, that you need to send me a check. I didn't say call me, I said send me a check. Scott.
What if you get multiple checks in the same day?
If I get 2 checks in the same day?
Yeah, like, so, and, you know, you can keep, like, does the other person get their money back? Like,
Yeah, I would be able to cash both checks. That would be called fraud, which we'll talk about later. It would be, if I phrased my offer in such an ambiguous way, I could be subject to suit. If 2 people want to buy the car, you know, now I'm basically inviting a lawsuit because I didn't make my offer very clear. And so it was difficult to respond to that offer. Which begs the next question is, what is the difference between an offer and an invitation to an offer? You may see something in a newspaper that says something like, the first 10 people to come down to our store will get a free battery for their car. Okay? The first 10 people that come down to our store by 10 o'clock will get a free battery for their car, regardless of what the make is. Now, is that an offer or is that an invitation to an offer? Well, it's probably an offer because it's very specific, right? It's very clear. It says the first 10 people that come down to our store will get a free battery for your car. Now, contrast that, if you want to stop by to our store sometime, you might get a free battery. Okay, that's elusive, right? That's not clear. That's not specific. That's probably just an invitation to an offer, which means you can show up if you want to, but you may not get a battery. Everybody understand the difference? So a lot of people ask, well, CJ, is an advertisement on the radio or even on the internet, is that an offer or is that an invitation to an offer? And I would answer it by saying it depends on how specific and clear the offer is. All right? Now, I want to talk about 2 different kinds of contracts, and then we're going to drill down into the essential components of a contract, which is offer, acceptance, and consideration. The 2 major types of offers, or contracts rather, is a unilateral contract and a bilateral contract. A unilateral contract and a bilateral contract. And we'll find out what the difference is and why it matters in a moment. Is it okay if I erase this stuff? Everybody have this? Okay. So let's take a look at unilateral contracts first. And by the way, my professor in law school who taught contract law, Professor Rick Coyle, who graduated from Columbia Law School, said in the very first night of class, you know, contract law is a seamless web. It doesn't matter where you start in this circle. It just keeps going around and around and around. So you could theoretically start studying contract law at offer, or acceptance, or consideration. It doesn't really matter, because all of these elements are intertwinable. And it doesn't really matter where you start studying contracts, because you're going to have to look at all these things at some point. And there's no really chronological way to do it, but I'm trying to present it to you so it makes some kind of sense. But feel free to interrupt me at any time. All right, so unilateral contract. What we have in a unilateral contract is a promise on one side and a performance on the other. A promise on one side and a performance on the other. All right, so let's go back to this balloon example with Angie for a moment. And I promise to deliver 2,000 red balloons for her birthday party. And she hands me a check for the full value of the contract. Okay? So I promised to do something, right? Which was to deliver the balloons. And she did something, right? She performed. She did something. That's a unilateral contract. A promise on one side, my promise to deliver, and performance on the other, which here is payment. Contrast that to what we call a bilateral contract. Bilateral. A bilateral contract can exist in two different ways. One, we have a promise on one side and a promise on the other side. Or we have performance on one side and performance on the other side. So let's say that I promise to paint Monica's house, right? She needs new paint on the outside of her house. And I promise to paint her house for $5,000. And she says, CJ, when you're done painting my house, I promise to give you a check. That's a bilateral contract, right? Now, contrast that to the fact that we may have had some preliminary discussions about painting her house, and I just show up and I start painting it, and a couple days later I'm done painting the house, and she gives me a check. Were there any promises made? There may be some implied promises, but there weren't any external oral promises made. In that case, we have a promise on one side that may be implied, but the better argument suggests that we have performance on both sides. My coming to paint the house and her paying me when I'm done. So the question becomes, how does a deal, how does a unilateral contract get transformed into a bilateral? At what point in the process? And the courts say when there's been a significant undertaking by one of the parties. So, if I'm going to paint Monica's house, if I hire a subcontractor to help me paint, if I buy materials, if I buy paint and sanding materials, whatever I need, then I've made a significant or substantial beginning towards actually performance. Now, here's the question. Interesting, this distinction between unilateral contracts and bilateral contracts. Very interesting. We have a promise on one side and performance on the other. That's unilateral. And bilateral promise for a promise or performance. Who cares? It sounds like a nice academic exercise in being able to distinguish these types of contracts, but who cares? All right, to understand the difference, we have to move down the line of this contract transaction, if you will. And let's assume, which I told you never to assume anything, but in this particular matter, let's say that one of the parties in this Monica CJ painting contract breaches the contract. Maybe I use the wrong kind of paint, right? Or maybe she doesn't pay me what she's supposed to pay me. Whatever it is. If I go to court and I've done some level of performance, it's easier for me to prove my damages, right? So if I'm going to court and I said, look, I painted Monica's house the way it was supposed to be painted, using the color of paint she wanted, to professional expectations, what's reasonable in the marketplace, and she didn't pay me what she was supposed to pay me, won't a court have a pretty easy time determining what I'm entitled to? Yes! But if it's just a promise on one side, I promise to paint her house, and I never do anything. I don't buy supplies. I don't hire independent contractors to work for me. I don't even put her job on my planning charts. What are my damages? The expectation of profits? Maybe. But it would be a lot easier to go to court and claim real damages if I've already had a significant beginning towards undertaking that contract. Does everybody understand that? It's going to be easier for me to prove my case if I've spent money and time trying to fulfill that contract versus just her promise being exchanged for my promise. And that's why we need to know whether a contract is unilateral or bilateral from the beginning. Because in a unilateral contract, it may be more difficult to determine the damages. That's really the only reason. Any questions so far? Yes?
So in a unilateral contract, how would you know that both parties, only one party agreed? Is it by now citing both names to a document, or how would you tell?
So if we have a unilateral contract, hopefully we have a written contract.
Yeah.
Okay? So if we just have a written contract and we both sign on it, that's a bilateral contract because you promised and I promised.
How would you tell us it's unilateral and one person signing it?
Well, if one person signs, it's not a deal because both people have to sign on the contract. It usually happens in oral agreements. It usually happens where I say, I'm going to sell you my car, right? And you show up with a cashier's check. So I'm promising to sell you the car, and you're actually doing something. That's very easy to understand that. Yeah. Good question. All right. Let's talk a little bit more about the essential elements of contracts. Is there a question? I'm sorry.
I don't get the performance and bilateral.
You don't get the performance on a bilateral contract?
Yeah, maybe there's two performances. Like,
Yeah. Okay, so let's say you came into my barber shop, just for the heck of it. You say nothing, you sit down in the seat, and I start cutting your hair. So I've done something, right? I performed.
So,
Now, the implied promise is that you're going to pay for the haircut afterwards. That's the implication. But you've said or done nothing.
So if I said, oh, I want a haircut, is that not a
So a better example would be you come into my shop, and I say, would you like a haircut? And you said yes. Okay, well, I can take you right now. I'd like to cut your hair. So I made a promise to cut your hair. You sit down in the chair, and as you're sitting down, you hand me $20 before I even cut your hair. So you performed by paying, and I haven't done anything yet. All I've done is promise to make that seat available for you.
That's unilateral.
In that particular case, it would be unilateral because I'm promising to cut his hair, and he's actually doing something. He's performing. Usually performance is payment, most of the time. Not always.
So performance for performance, what would be a good example of that?
So if I drove my car, you were sitting by my car, I drive my Ferrari over to your house, and you give me a cashier's check. Or better yet, I give you the pink slip, and you give me a check.
Okay.
Real-time exchange.
An example of performance is like a restaurant business, not a company or
So the minute you sit down at the restaurant, except for one place where they made you pay up front, and I forgot where it was, I think it was in Atlanta, I guess a lot of people were ripping them off. So when you sat down and you ordered your meal at the table, I mean, I can understand going to a takeout place and you stand in line, you buy your food, and then they tell you your stuff's ready. But this was like a nice, fancy restaurant. And as soon as I sat down, they said after I gave my order, I had to pay. So I performed right there, which is kind of unusual. Usually it's usually when the customer goes into the restaurant, the implication is that they're going to pay, right? But they don't do anything.
Right.
There could be an implied promise to pay. And when the food comes to my table, they perform. So they've cooked my meal, or done whatever they were supposed to do, served me the food. So that would be a unilateral contract, probably, with an implied promise to pay. Or you'd be arrested. Any other questions about? Yes?
So back to the barbershop example, you said that it's a unilateral because they promised to cut your hair and then you paid. But wouldn't it change if they actually cut your hair and then you already paid? Is that fair?
Yeah, so if you paid up front, which I don't think I've ever had my haircut where I paid before, because what if I didn't like my haircut? So typically, you pay afterwards, most of the time. Now, if they say, hey, look, our cash machine's not working properly, do you mind paying up front? Or I'm leaving right after I cut your hair and I won't have time to do the transaction, maybe they'll pay up front. But probably not. Probably going to pay after. So once they start cutting your hair, it becomes a unilateral contract. Now, if I sit down and they start cutting my hair and I have a $20 bill, then we have what we call a bargain for exchange, and we probably have a bilateral contract. Any other questions? Yes?
Can you repeat? You had said that performance was harder to prove damage?
No, a unilateral contract where there's performance, let me restate that. If you have only a promise to do something, then it's more difficult to ascertain your damages. But where you have a unilateral contract and there's been performance by one party, the party that performs can prove their damages. So the unilateral contract, where it becomes difficult, is a bilateral contract where there are promises on both sides. It's harder to distinguish what your damages are, unless it's lost profits. But where performance is met with performance on the other side, it's easy to prove damages, because both parties have done something to their detriment. Okay, does that clear that up?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions about unilateral versus bilateral? Okay, if you get tested on this, it will be like 1 or 2 questions, so don't get too hung up on it. Offer, acceptance, consideration, damages. Damages may be available if there's been a breach of the contract. So let's drill down into these essential elements of the contract. And I'll try to do it fairly succinctly. When we were talking about a meeting of the minds, we were thinking about the offer. So an offer is easily boiled down to saying a manifestation of willingness to be bound, or an interest in entering into a contract or an agreement. That's what an offer is. Interest in engaging in a contract. I'm just interested in it. That doesn't mean the other side is going to agree to my terms, right? We saw when we were talking about this balloon transaction with Angie, she didn't want blue balloons, she wanted red balloons. So whatever I was offering to her was of no interest. No interest at all. Acceptance is a manifestation of assent, which just means agreement. Could you, Michael, could you agree to a contract through silence, through saying nothing? Could you manifest your assent, or could you agree to something by remaining silent?
Yes, I can.
Did you say yes?
Yes.
That's the correct answer. If silence under those circumstances are reasonable. So example, if everybody wants to leave before 6 today, say nothing. Beautiful. So you just all agreed to leave here before 6. As a matter of fact, we'll probably leave before that. But the point is, if I've set up my offer for you to accept it by saying nothing, that could be a reasonable way of accepting it. I can tailor how you accept my offer because I am the offeror. I'm the master of the offer. And just when Angie turned things around on me unexpectedly, and one of those red balloons, which I have a difficulty getting my hands on, blue balloons are plentiful this time of year. For Easter, I can't find any red balloons. But once she turns things around on me, now she becomes the master of the offer. She's the offeror. Through her counteroffer, we changed places. Now she can tailor her offer any way she wants. If you want to sell me those red balloons, come down to my office and show me what you've got. Okay? The minute I show up, maybe we've got a deal, maybe we don't. I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't know yet. It may be an illusory contract where she's just wasting my time with every balloon vendor in the world. Maybe that's what she likes to do. So, acceptance at common law was a pretty tricky thing. At common law, we use something called the mirror image rule. I'll show you how that looks. Now remember, we're still talking about acceptance. And let's use this little balloon thing because it's pretty easy to understand. I promise to sell Angie 200 blue balloons at $2 per unit. Okay? Let's say I wrote this to her. You know, maybe I met her at a gift show and she's been searching for balloons. And I write her back. And I say, you know what, Angie, I know you've been looking for some balloons, and I promise to sell you these beautiful balloons for only $2 a piece. Okay? So now we got, what, a $4,000 deal on the table? Is that what it is? Or $400? $400 deal. $400 deal. Okay. She writes back. Right? She thinks about my offer. She contemplates it. And she would say, CJ, I'd love to buy your red balloons at 75 cents per unit. Do we have a problem? Yes. I would say that even under modern law, we have no meeting of the minds. What we have here is a counter offer, right? I wrote her very specifically, would anybody like to argue that my offer is not clear? As to price term, subject matter, quantity. Very specific, right? And that's how we determine if an offer is very specific. Is there a clear price point? Is there a clear quantity? Now, I don't say what the time of delivery is, but we can discuss that further. But when I offer in my unilateral contract to sell Angie 200 blue balloons at $2 a unit, she's rejecting my offer in many different ways. First of all, she's asking for red balloons. I'm selling blue balloons, and she wants them at 75 cents a unit. I'm selling them for $2. We have no deal. Right? At common law, if we're using the mirror image rule, we definitely don't have a deal, because under the mirror image rule, every element of my offer must look exactly like every element of the acceptance. So if I put an amendment and I said, to agree to my deal, please send a check, and you come by with cash. New counteroffer, right? I asked for a check, and you came up with cash. Now, it might be reasonable to accept cash, but for some reason I ask for a check. And you show up with cash. New counteroffer. Violation of the mirror image rule. Your acceptance doesn't look like my offer. Okay? Everybody clear on the mirror image rule at common law? The terms and the acceptance must look exactly like the terms of the offer. Otherwise, no meeting of the minds, no deal. And that can happen if you're negotiating with a vendor to sell you a software package, or a new copy machine, or business cards, whatever it is. Hey, you told me you're going to sell me 1,000 business cards for 40 bucks. Oh, that was, yeah, I'm sorry, that was with the non-raised printing. Oh, but I wanted raised printing. Well, you didn't say that. So we don't have a deal. Any questions about this? All right. So now, let's talk about consideration. We've talked about offer. We've talked about acceptance. And now, let's jump into consideration. At common law, in the feudal system, we had something called the peppercorn theory. Peppercorn was simply a symbol of a transaction. A symbol of a transaction. So if Michael wanted to buy my land, he would simply give me a peppercorn, and I would give him a deed to the property if I agreed that that peppercorn had some intrinsic or symbolic value. In the United States, money, paper money, has no value. Right? Paper money has no value. Treasury notes are built around trust. We used to have something called the gold standard, which meant that if you had a $10 bill in your pocket, it could be equatable to a certain amount of gold. We don't have that anymore. So if you don't value my $10 in your store, say, look, I don't honor American currency, we don't have a deal. Right? That $10 is worthless. Absolutely worthless. It's just all built on trust. But if Michael and I are both willing to assign value to that peppercorn, we have a good deal. Because now we have an offer, acceptance, and consideration. Think of consideration as something antithetical to a gift. Okay? So if I, tell me your name. Me. If I give me my jacket, right, and she doesn't give me any money, that's a gift, right? But if I tell her this jacket is 400 bucks, and she gives me 400 bucks, and I give her the jacket, that's consideration. That's what we call a bargained for exchange in real time. Consideration is the glue that binds the contract. Without consideration, you might have a gift promise, but you have no contract. Without consideration, you have a gift. And gifts do not adhere to the tenets of contract law. It's a whole different subject matter, which we're going to maybe talk about at some point if we ever talk about probate law, which we probably won't because it doesn't relate to business too often. But without that consideration, there's no glue that binds that contract between me and me. It's simply a gift. A bargained for exchange must be a real-time transaction. Must be a real-time transaction because past consideration is no consideration. Past consideration is no consideration. Scott and I were in a horrible war together, hypothetically, and Scott saved my life. He said, you know, there's enemy fire coming down the hill, CJ. You better hunker down. And by Scott giving me that warning, he saved my life. And he said, you know what, Scott, you saved my life. My family is going to love you. Or maybe not. And when I come back home, I'm going to knock on your door and I'm going to give you a plasma screen television. value $10,000. Unbelievable sound system. You're going to have a little movie theater inside your house. Because you saved my life. 6 months go by, we're both back home. Scott calls me up and saying, hey, CJ, you know, it's about time for the Super Bowl, and I was kind of waiting on that plasma screen television. What's going on? So what are you talking about? He sues me in court. He said, hey, when we were in danger, in harm's way, and I saved your life, you promised me, dude. You promised me to give me a plasma screen television for saving your life. We go to court. Guess what the judge is going to say? Sorry, Scott. That's past consideration. That happened in the past. There's no bargain for exchange that's happening as we speak. It's only when I give Monica the invoice for the paint job and she hands me cash that we've got a deal, right? We've got a bargain for exchange. I'm giving her the invoice, she's paying me money. Or I painted her house, she pays me money. It's happening in real time. We call it quid pro quo. Anybody ever see that movie, Silence of the Lambs, with Anthony Hopkins? He goes, he's in jail, and Jodie Foster is playing a police officer, I believe, and she goes to visit him, and she's trying to get some information, right? She wants to know who's this new person conducting these mass murders, and the character that's being played by Anthony Hopkins is probably going to give her some information, but he wants some quid pro quo. He wants something in exchange for giving the information, right? We call that a bargain for exchange. So, in consideration, if it's happening in real time, we have a benefit to one party and a detriment to the other. Now, looking at it in a more holistic perspective, if Michael and I are transacting for me to sell my house, we could both be winners, right? Because I'm getting a profit for my house, particularly in today's marketplace, where it's sort of a seller's market, and he's getting a place to live, right? So there's a benefit on both sides. Maybe there's a detriment on both sides too. He's giving up his money, and I'm giving up my house, and I'm going to live somewhere else. But the main thing to think about when you're contemplating this concept of consideration is that it's happening in real time. One more example, then I'm going to give you a little group exercise and we'll take a break. Past consideration is no consideration. Additionally, if I'm a police officer and Nee hires me to track down somebody who burglarized her house, and I say, you know what, Nee? I'd be glad to help you find the person that burglarized your house. You got to give me $5,000. No go. I am already obligated by virtue of my position or my career to help her find the person who burglarized her house. If I try to extract money from her, there's no deal. There's no good consideration there because I'm already obligated to try to find the person who burglarized her house, right? I can't try to extract money from her for doing what I'm already obligated to do. So past consideration is no good, and if I'm already obligated to do something, I can't try to extract consideration for doing my job. Perry.
So, it's a little far out there, but my government class we were talking about interest groups with the Congress and stuff. So if we can prove that Congress is using money from interest groups to
Special interest groups.
Yeah, they'll be doing something that they should already be doing, but in the interest of the interest group, then it's what? There's no consideration?
Yeah. Yeah, if they were already obligated to do that, so if Congress is already obligated to ration water to the masses, and they have some special interest group trying to extract or give them some benefit, then that would be a void transaction. It's probably illegal too, because there's some probably some probable bribery statutes out there too that I'm not aware of. Yeah. All right, one more thing before we take our break. And next week we're going to talk about performance issues. When are people obligated to perform a contract, and what are some of the excuses for not performing? could be mistake. We talked a little bit about mistake today. It could be impossibility. I can't perform, I can't deliver those balloons to Angie because there's been an earthquake in my factory. Well, maybe that's just bogus because I can go buy those balloons somewhere else. I might do so at a loss, but that's the risk I take of being in business and offering commodities. So one more concept, though, that I want to leave you with before next week when we talk about performance of contracts and breach is one concept of damages. So if one party breaches the contract and the non-breaching party is looking for compensation, then those damages must be certain. I've given you the example of a brand new business trying to prove lost profits, and that becomes a very speculative endeavor. Now, if I have a Burger King franchise and I've been operating for 30 years, I could probably tell you with some certainty what my profits are, right? But if I'm a startup business and I'm just starting to sell some new commodity, it's going to be difficult for me to prove my damages because I'm brand new in business. I might be able to find some comps for similar businesses, but it's still going to be speculative. Under the case of Hadley versus Baxendale, which I have way down here, which I'll tell you about in a moment, damages to be recoverable must be foreseeable to the breaching party at the time of contracting. Quick story. Hadley operates a mill. And I think this was in the 1800s. And Hadley was shut down because one of the pieces of their sawmill broke. And this was a very special piece. Hadley goes to Baxendale's office, and Baxendale runs a messenger service. And Hadley expects that Baxendale is going to get this part back from the factory very quickly. Because without this part knee, he can't produce whatever he's producing in his factory. His operations are shut down. He's losing thousands of dollars every day. So Hadley goes to Baxendale with the intent of expediting the return of this piece that he needs for his sawmill or factory. But the problem is, Hadley never tells Baxendale that time is of the essence. Never says, look, I need you to expedite this piece because without it, I'm out of business. Never tells him that. So the Court of Exchequer in Great Britain says, look, Baxendale had no special information, and had Baxendale known that Hadley needed this part right away, could have done several things. Could have rejected the deal, right? Didn't want that liability of lost profits. Could have asked for a premium by charging more money, right? What else could he have done? Denied the contract, accepted more money, told them that he couldn't have it back in time. But he'll do his best. So the lesson to be learned in Hadley versus Baxendale is that at the time of contracting, the breaching party will only be liable for damages if the breach is foreseeable at that point in time. Everybody clear on that? Okay. It is now 4 o'clock. I've talked for about an hour. I have boiled down the essential ingredients of contract law from a year course to about an hour. And hopefully you've learned something. You will come back here in about 30 minutes, having become refreshed, get some water, use the restroom, get some coffee, and you will be engaged. You guys will sound somewhat facile. It will be easy to engage in, but difficult to master. and this is what I want you to do. I have outlined for you the facts of the case of Hadley versus Baxendale. So the first assignment, and you can use the internet, by the way, to look the case up. It should be in your book as well. The first question I want you to discuss in your group was the holding or the decision in Hadley versus Baxendale. Was it fair? Was it just? Was it fair? The second thing that I want you to do is to answer this question. So question number one, what do you think the holding in Hadley versus Baxendale? Was it fair? Second question. By the way, there are no correct answers. Second question. How do you protect yourself in business against a party that breaches their contract with you? Let's say you need some software to run your business, and the other party that's supposedly selling the software doesn't deliver it to you on time, and you lose a key account. What can you do, or what type of phraseology could you use in your contract